Hey, Amy, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. For anyone who's kind of tuned in here late, this is Amy Green, and she is the lead author, I guess is the right title, on the Reluctant Redemption of Verity Lux. Amy, thank you so much for sitting down with us. Historically, Amy and I actually have known each other a long time. And one of the first things that she's probably most well known for is a game called That Dragon Cancer, which has been like a huge impact on the kind of cultural zeitgeist around gaming and everything else. It's a very personal story for her. But without putting words in your mouth, tell us a little about your history. How did you get involved in gaming?
Sure. I have never thought of myself really as a gamer. It's something that I've had to kind of like very gradually recognize, like, oh, I play a lot of games. I just didn't like own that identity for myself necessarily. I thought of myself as a reader, as a storyteller, as a writer, more than I ever thought of myself as a gamer. So really, through the creation of That Dragon Cancer, it's kind of my origin story as a game developer. Ryan, my husband, and I are both creative people. We both care about expressing the things that we're going through. I don't think that's everybody. I think some people go through things and their goal is to suppress those things, and our goal is usually to express those things. So just knowing we were both wired that way, it did not surprise me that when our son was diagnosed with cancer, that became something we wanted to express. We wanted to express what it was like as parents, as family members, as people who loved Joel, to kind of go through this with him. And initially, That Dragon Cancer was really Ryan's form of expression. It was only after Joel died that I started to really think of it as like also my form of expression. So that kind of marked this pivotal shift in the process where I was helping and involved, and I would attend some meetings and I would write some little scenes, but I was very much on the periphery. And then after Joel died, I realized like, oh, I care very much what every mechanic feels like. I care very much what we are saying about this experience, what we are saying about who Joel was, what we are saying about even like who God was in this experience in relation to us and our pain and our suffering. And so at that point, I started to really get involved in all of the design meetings. I started to care about the mechanics and the story and how those connect to each other. And it wasn't really until the end of creating that video game with Ryan and the rest of the team at Numinous Games that I really started to think of myself as a game developer. I don't think I would have ever entered this area, this industry, in any other way, because it's not how I thought of myself. But what I learned was that I loved thinking about the story in terms of the mechanics. I loved thinking about game mechanics as symbolism, as metaphor, as poetry. And it just opened a whole new world to me. So sometimes I still think it's weird that I'm a game developer. I always say, like, if I sit down and get my hair cut and my stylist is like, oh, what do you do for a living? And I'm like, oh, I make video games. I just know I'm like not who people expect in that role. But I a lot of times say that I feel like it's a gift Joel gave me. Like kind of one of the last gifts he gave me was sort of this whole new world to tell stories in and to explore in that I probably would never have engaged with, except that he was so important to me. And so since the story was already happening in this medium, I had to learn more about this medium.
That put you and Ryan, I think, in the center of, at the time, so this is 10 years ago, or might like 15? Where are we thinking? When
almost 10. Not quite 10 when it
almost
released.
10.
Yeah.
Okay, so That Dragon Cancer comes out, and it's in the middle of a conversation culturally, which is essentially like, can a video game ever be art? And your story in particular, and not just for you, but for a lot of people in the world, were like, this is an example of exactly why it is art, and it's good art, and especially because it's so personal, it's so emotional. But now, and maybe this is true of like all artists, now a very personal story for you is part of your public persona. Like, how has that been?
You know, it like anything, it has really wonderful parts to it. It has some more negative parts to it. It is strange to kind of say that like, oh, out of our grief, we created a cultural artifact. I know,
Yeah.
when Joel died, his funeral was really hard and emotional. But in some ways, the release of this game was harder and more emotional. It was almost like we didn't have to close that chapter
Mm.
on Joel as long as we were still kind of living our lives for him by making this game. And so there is something about taking something so deeply personal and sharing it with the world that kind of catches you by surprise. Like, you know what you're doing, but you don't really understand the ramifications of it until it's really released and out there. I remember just kind of sitting in the middle of all of these big emotions, telling Ryan at one point that it felt a little like I left out my diary and someone took a big red pen and started editing my diary. And he said, yeah, except that it's more like you published your diary. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. And the reviews were predominantly very, very positive. It's not that people were saying hard things, or it was just that they were analyzing it as you would a cultural artifact. And then somewhere underneath that, It's like, oh, this is my life. Like, this is a lived experience also. But parts of it are so wonderful. There are parents who I hear say all the time that after they lost a child, people never say that child's name anymore, never talk to them about them. They're afraid to bring up this child who they love and want to talk about out of fear that they'll somehow make it harder or bring up sadness that otherwise wouldn't be there. And so I love that I'm always asked about Joel, that I get a chance to talk about him and what he meant to us and our family. Yeah. So that part of it has been really, really beautiful.
I think I think that the question of celebrity is an interesting one. Like Ryan said, like you publish your diary, like for better or for worse. I've never asked you this, but how actually do your other kids, how do they process this question? Maybe they're sick of it, maybe, I don't know.
Sure. It's always strange to them when someone tells them like, oh, I played that game. I know who your parents are. I know who you are. And it doesn't happen that often, but it happens, a few times a year that they'll meet someone and befriend them. And, over the course of time, we'll say, oh, yeah, my parents develop games. And then the person will say, oh, yeah, actually, I know I watched that Let's Play. I watched Markiplier's Let's Play, or I watched Jacksepticeye's Let's Play. And so I think it mostly just surprises them still that for us, it's just sort of a thing we did. But I guess that we see that happen sometimes. I mean, in our hometown, right? We're nobody. We're just people. Like, nobody knows we even make games. It's not a thing. But sometimes if we go to a conference or an event, we'll meet someone and make good friends and hang out and talk to them. And 2 hours in, they'll be like, oh, by the way, I know who you guys are. And then you kind of circle
just
back
so
and go, did I say anything I shouldn't have? Did we come off wrong? Are we disrupting your impression of us? And so I think that's just still odd, and it's because we have no notoriety or fame in our day-to-day life. And so when you occasionally kind of get into a space where someone does know you, it always catches you off guard.
Well, you speak to something that I think, I've had a chance to witness for many years, is you particular, I think, have wound up being an advocate for gaming, for arts, for gaming as an art in places like the TED Talks and BAFTA. I've seen you do public speaking on this matter. So you've become kind of a subject matter expert, and tell me what is your heart for all that? Where do you want to see that go? That conversation?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I love to talk about games as art, games as expression, because it's still such a young medium. I mean, it really felt like a young medium 10 years ago. It really, really felt like a young medium 20 years ago. Yeah. But in the grand scheme of things, there is still so much to explore about how a story told through a game impacts our imagination, how it changes us, how it shifts us. I love that it can encompass people of all types and all kinds of artists. Like a lot of times people think like, oh, it's just for super technical people, just programmers. But no, like there's
Right.
there's musicians, there's artists, there's writers, there's every kind of artistic expression that like can be used within games. You do have to learn a little more technical stuff than maybe you would like for me writing a story in a game. I need to know a little more technical stuff and work with more technical people than I would just writing a book on my own. But working with a team like that, it just it kind of balloons into such a beautiful thing when we can all work together. And usually the technical pieces are just the language we use to communicate with each other what we're intending. But I think there's still so much to explore about how games impact people, specifically because you're not a passive participant to the story like you are when you read a book or watch a movie. You're in the story in some way, making choices, impacting the outcome. And so you feel a part of it in a way that other mediums of storytelling just haven't tapped into. And I don't think we even know yet the impact that has with people and how it sticks with them. Also, a lot of times games you consume over a long period of time. And I have a tendency to think that impacts us differently than when we can sit down and watch a movie in 2 hours and it's done. It can be profound, but how much can something shift me in a 2-hour span compared to those same things kind of having time to develop inside of me and for me to imagine them and think about them and consider the repercussion over a period of months or sometimes years.
That's really good. Well, obviously, like, and I'll make sure I add some links and that kind of jazz, probably some video and some screenshots on the sidebar, but like, you're kind of a big deal. Like in this whole story, like you were a real pioneer. You and Ryan started something that hadn't really been done. You've been featured lots of times and honored appropriately. So I'm really grateful that you decided to work with us on this story. So I think I'll pivot to a different story or a different piece of our conversation. Obviously,